Lurkers explores the dark side of the online world. It contains adult themes and disturbing content for mature audiences only.
Out in the California desert, a red Kia Soul is running out of road. Patrol units are closing in from behind. A sheriff's helicopter is overheard. Inside the car, police believe is a 15-year-old girl. They don't know if she's hurt. They don't know what he's told her. They only know the driver is armed. And this stop cannot go wrong. At first, it sounds like another urgent alert. A missing teen, a suspect vehicle, a high-risk stop moving through San Bernardino County. But the voices coming over the radio carry something heavier than routine. Something tighter, because this is no ordinary abduction alert. Then the name comes through. Austin Lee Edwards, 28 years old, a deputy sheriff, former Virginia State Police. And just like that, the whole thing changes, because now the danger isn't only the man behind the wheel, it's the badge behind the man. And back in Riverside, California, police are only beginning to uncover the shape of the nightmare he just left behind. In a world where connection is effortless, every click feels safe. But online, trust can be deceiving. This is Lurkers, true stories of trust, desire, and how technology, if unchecked, can turn it all against us. Before we go any further, sit with a part that doesn't fit. Not the desert, not the missing girl, not even the car. The badge. Because there's a human reflex at work here. Something called authority bias. We hear a title, see a uniform, catch the calm official tone, and some part of us relaxes. Not because we're foolish, because almost from childhood, we're trained to. Most of the time, that reflex helps the world function. But in the wrong hands, it becomes camouflage. And that matters here, because this story is not only about a man who lied online. It's about a man whose other face, the one the real world could see, already came stamped with authority. And that is one of the hardest kinds of danger to spot. The kind that doesn't need to force trust. It arrives already wearing it. But before we keep going, if you've been following Lurkers, thank you. We love to have you here. If these stories matter to you, following the show, leaving a quick rating, or sharing an episode with someone else really does help us keep telling them, and helps more people recognize what can hide behind a screen. Alright, let's go back. Just like you heard in the beginning, Austin Lee Edwards was 28 years old, from North Chesterfield, Virginia. On paper, he looked like the kind of man who a frightened family might trust without thinking twice. Riverside police later identified him as a former Virginia State Police trooper who had recently gone to work for the Washington County Sheriff's Office in Virginia. And according to later reporting from the Associated Press, that new job had begun just 9 days before the nightmare that unfolded in Riverside. Before that, he had joined Virginia State Police in July of 2021 and resigned 9 months later. So, if you were only looking at the outline of his life, the job titles, the agencies, the uniform, the age, you might have seen a younger officer still finding his place, a man building a career, a man who had already passed through institutions designed, at least in theory, to filter out danger. And that's the part that should make you uneasy, because we talk a lot about online deception like it lives entirely inside the screen. Fake names, fake photos, fake stories, but sometimes the most effective disguise is not digital at all. Sometimes it's institutional. Sometimes it's a badge, a title, a calm voice, the kind of presentation that makes suspicion feel rude, even when suspicion is the one thing that might save you. By late November of 2022, the public version of Austin Lee Edwards was still intact. Former state trooper, newly hired deputy sheriff, a man who, from the outside, still looked connected to order, rules, and protection. The exact kind of image that can buy a predator something invaluable. Time. Time before people questioned him. Time before they pulled away. Time before the story he was telling started to crack. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away from Virginia, another story was already taking shape. Not in a patrol car, not in a station, not in public, on a screen. In Riverside, California, a 15-year-old girl was living inside what should have felt like ordinary life. Home, family, messages, a private conversation that seemed to belong only to her phone. But the person on the other end was not who he said he was. And the distance between those two versions of Austin Lee Edwards, the officer on paper and the boy she thought she was getting to know on screen, was about to collapse. Because while one identity was visible to the world, the other was already moving closer. Now, the second version of Austin Lee Edwards did not wear a badge. We usually start the other way around, right? It lived on screen, and as the Los Angeles Times later reported, the person he pretended to be was a 17-year-old boy. The false identity he used while communicating with a 15-year-old girl in Riverside. Investigators believe the exchange involved the familiar mechanics of grooming and sextortion. At first, that kind of contact can look like nothing. A message, a reply, a little attention at the right time. Someone who seems curious, safe, interested. That is how private worlds get built. Not all at once, piece by piece. They do not begin with force. They begin with familiarity. A predator studies what lowers a guard. Warmth, attention, secrecy, the feeling of being chosen, the feeling that what is happening belongs only to you. A conversation that starts to feel separate from everything else, from home, from family, from the ordinary protections around you, and in details later laid out in a federal complaint, and first highlighted by Fox News. That private world began taking shape in the summer of 2022. The girl met him on Instagram. Later, they also communicated on Discord. She kept the relationship secret from her family, and he did what predators like this often do when messages alone are not enough. He made himself useful. He sent jewelry, groceries, money, gift cards, paid for Uber Eats and DoorDash, even helped her buy birthday gifts for friends. Yep, that is part of the trap too. Not just attention. Investment. The sense that someone is showing up for you, providing, giving, making himself feel woven into your life before he has ever earned a place in it. And guess what else? Later lawsuit details said the pressure became more overt, that he grew clingy, then pushy, and kept pressing her to send nude photos of herself. Then she stopped responding, and that detail matters because according to those later complaint details, she broke things off right after Halloween. She blocked him on Instagram, and even then, he still found a way to send her a suicide letter. He was heartbroken. And for most people, that would have been the end of it. A conversation broken, a fake profile that lost its grip, a stranger disappearing back into the noise of the internet. But by then, the contact had already done what this kind of contact is meant to do. It had created access, and Austin Lee Edwards had something most online predators do not. A second identity in the real world, a sanctioned one, a title, training, a life that made him look disciplined instead of dangerous. And instead of letting the distance hold, he closed it. What had been living quietly inside a phone was no longer staying there. The lie was about to start moving. Thanksgiving week of 2022 was unfolding the way it always does in America. Airports crowded, freeways packed, families crossing counties and state lines to get home. And moving inside that same holiday current was Austin Lee Edwards, leaving Virginia, driving west toward Riverside, California. This was no longer a man hiding behind a screen and letting fantasy fade by morning. This was now a man carrying it across the country. And that is what the road revealed, because a drive like that gave a person chances. Chances to stop, chances to turn around, chances to let whatever poison was growing in private stay there. He kept going, state line after state line, exit after exit, daylight giving away to night and then back again. The road did not cool anything down. It preserved it, protected it, gave it time to harden. By Friday, November 25th, he had reached Riverside, and that is where this story grew heavier, because we like to think of the internet as distance, a buffer, a layer of glass between a lie and the life that is aimed at. But sometimes, the screen is only the first room. He was no longer a username, no longer a string of messages. The road was how the lie became physical. When Austin Lee Edwards reached Price Court, the lie was no longer living behind a screen. It was standing at a front door. Mark Winnick was 69. Cherie Winnick was 65. Their daughter, Brooke Winnick, was 38. Brooke had two daughters, both of them Mark and Cherie's granddaughters. The older girl was 15, the one Edwards had been communicating with online. The younger girl was her sister. And on that morning of Friday, November 25th, 2022, Mark and Cherie were at the house on Price Court, but Brooke and her two daughters were not. In a deeper reconstruction, the Los Angeles Times reported that Edwards had already been on the street before he ever knocked, moving up and down Price Court in a trench coat and fedora, circling the house, then returning around 9 a.m. to approach the door, posing as a detective. He told Cherie he was conducting an investigation involving Brooke's 15-year-old daughter, and that Brooke and the teen needed to come to the house so he could ask them some questions. The thing is, The night before, Brooke and her 2 daughters had spent Thanksgiving at Golden Corral with Brooke's boyfriend, and stayed overnight at his apartment in Moreno Valley. The next morning, they went to Starbucks and they were planning to go Black Friday shopping. And that is when Cherie's call came about the detective. Later court filings would fill in more of the sequence. Brooke didn't tell her daughters that a detective wanted to question them. Instead, she gave them a calmer explanation. She said there was something wrong with their phones and that they needed to go back to Price Court to get them fixed. On the way, Brooke dropped her younger daughter off with a relative, then drove to the house with her 15-year-old teen. By the time they arrived, Mark and Cherie were already inside. Brooke went in too. Her 15-year-old daughter stayed in the car, and while the 15-year-old waited, she noticed things that did not feel right. Her mom's dog was not in the window like usual. The windows of the house were closed. Brooke had gone inside, and too much time was passing, so she got out and walked to the front door. Then the room answered every wrong feeling at once. She was grabbed by the hair and pulled inside by a man she did not recognize. She saw her grandmother near the entryway, her grandfather by the stairs, her mother on the hardwood floor, all of them with bags over their heads, taped to their necks, their arms and legs bound with duct tape. She screamed. The man pointed a gun at her, and when he spoke, she recognized his voice. It was Austin, the boy from the screen. The complaint would later allege that Edwards was still wearing the image of authority even then, a badge on his belt, a law enforcement handgun in his hand. It also alleged that he dragged the girl through the house while setting fires, then forced her back outside and into the vehicle. But there were people outside of the house seeing pieces of this too. ABC7 later reported that a neighbor had already called police once about an unfamiliar car with Virginia plates parked in her driveway. About half an hour later, she called again after seeing Edwards walk back to the red Kia Soul with the girl. The witness said the girl looked distressed, like she was trying to say something, but could not get the words out. At about 11:08 that morning, Riverside police were dispatched to Price Court to check on her. While they were still responding, calls from a few houses away came in about a structure fire. When first responders reached the home, they found what the lie had become. Mark Winnick, Cherie Winnick, and Brooke Winnick were dead. And the 15-year-old girl Edwards had been communicating with online was gone. Out in San Bernardino County, the desert, the Kia, the girl inside it. By then, authorities had caught up to them. This was no longer just a rescue. It was the end of a manhunt. Neighbors and security footage helped trace Edwards into the Mojave Desert, where San Bernardino County authorities picked up the chase. Inside the Kia, with a 15-year-old still trapped in the back, Edwards fired through the rear window, filling the car with smoke. A fuel canister tipped and splashed her with gasoline. Then the road gave out. The Kia drifted off and jammed up on rocks beneath the bridge. Patrol cars closed in. Edwards told the girl to get out. She did. He stayed behind. And in the final seconds of the pursuit, Austin Lee Edwards turned the service weapon on himself. She survived. The immediate threat was over. But the deeper question had only begun to take shape. How did a man carrying this much danger also carry a badge? In the narrow sands, the case was over. Austin Lee Edwards was dead. The 15-year-old girl had survived. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no courtroom where he would have to answer for what he had done. But sadly, that is not where this story ends, because once the man was gone, what was left was the system that let him keep moving. And according to the Associated Press, that system had already failed years earlier. In 2016, Edwards threatened to kill himself and his father, and a judge later barred him from purchasing, possessing, or transporting firearms. ABC7 later added details from Virginia police records. His father had called for help. Edwards had cut his hand in a bathroom, struggled with his father, refused police orders, fought efforts to handcuff him, and was then taken for psychiatric evaluation. But when Virginia State Police later ran his background, an investigator searched the wrong database and used the wrong code, missing the order that should have disqualified him. He was then hired by state police in July 2021, resigned 9 months later, and was then hired by the Washington County Sheriff's Office just 9 days before the nightmare in Riverside. So by the time he crossed the country under a fake identity, the real question was no longer just how dangerous he was. It was how many chances he had already been given. How many doors had opened? How many screenings had failed? How many institutions had looked at something disqualifying and somehow let it pass? And even after the murders, the accountability story stayed murky. When Virginia public media looked at what happened next, it found that although Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin had called for a quote-unquote full investigation, the watchdog agency never produced the kind of official report many expected. Because of an existing agreement between agencies, Virginia State Police appeared to have largely investigated themselves. What surfaced instead was a letter, one that described the failure as quote-unquote human error and an quote-unquote isolated incident. But for the surviving family, isolated was never going to be enough. And the court record shows that the fight did not end in 2024. In September 2025, a federal judge in Virginia allowed multiple higher negligence claims in the grandparents' estate case to keep moving forward. Then, in January 2026, this year, that same court denied another motion to dismiss in the Brooke Winnick estate case, which means the civil reckoning is still alive. The man who did this is gone. The question of who enabled him is not. And this is where Lurkers wants to focus your attention, not just on the predator, but on the mechanism, because a fake identity online can be devastating, but a real identity backed by real authority can be catastrophic. That is what makes this case different. Not only that Austin Lee Edwards lied, not only that he groomed a child, not only that he crossed the country and turned a family home into a crime scene, it is that the lie did not stay digital. It was reinforced by a badge, a job title, a service weapon, a version of authority that made people hesitate just long enough to let him get closer. And the truth, my friends, this is the part worth sitting with, because danger does not always arrive looking suspicious. Sometimes it arrives looking official. Sometimes it sounds calm. Sometimes it uses the language of procedure, protection, and help. And if we're taught, almost from when we were children, to lower our guard around that kind of power, the wrong person can slip inside that trust and use it as shelter. And this is the end of Lurker Season 2. If there is one thread running through the stories we told this season, it's this: what starts online does not always stay online. A message becomes a meeting, a profile becomes a trap, a voice becomes panic, a lie becomes a road, and a screen becomes a doorway. Different cases, different victims, different platforms, same crossing. Because behind every story this season, there was a moment when something digital stopped feeling abstract and turned physical, emotional, financial, social, deadly. That is what the internet can do in the wrong hands. Not because the screen itself is evil, but because it gives people new ways to get close before we understand who they are. So remember Mark Winnick, remember Cherie Winnick, remember Brooke Winnick, and remember the 15-year-old girl who survived the lie after it crossed out of the screen and into her family's life. Because in the end, this is not a cautionary tale about one family failing to be careful enough. No, it is a cautionary tale because what they were up against wore two faces at once, a boy on a screen and a man the real world had already stamped as trustworthy. As always, stay aware, stay present, stay safe. I want to say thank you to everyone who's been with us through Season 2. These stories are meant to make us pause before we click, before we reply, before we trust, and let someone closer than we should. And if this episode stayed with you, pass lurkers on, follow the show, and leave a quick rating or review if your app allows it. Thanks for listening. See you next season.